Hello, hello, and welcome as I attempt to set things up. Apparently, Periscope doesn't like it when I put a return into the name of the broadcast, and for some reason that causes it to not share to Twitter immediately. But this time it apparently worked. So, hi Hal, welcome. Welcome. So we're in Virginia, reading the Nutcracker, and yesterday we got up to the end of the battle. The end of the battle between the dolls and the mice. And at the very end, the seven-headed Mouse King was about to bite Nutcracker to pieces, and Marie threw her shoe at him. And then she felt a pain in her arm and fainted. So, let's just jump right into it. Marie's illness. When Marie awoke from her deep, death-like sleep, she was lying in her little bed. The sun was shining into the window, sparkling on the ice-coated window panes. A strange gentleman was sitting beside her, but she soon recognized him as Dr. Wendelstern. "She's awake," he said softly. Her mother came over and gave her an anxious, questioning look. "Oh, Mother dear," Marie whispered, "have all the nasty mice gone away? Was Nutcracker saved?" "Don't talk such nonsense, child," said her mother. "What have mice got to do with Nutcracker? Oh, you naughty child, we've been so worried about you. That's what happens when children are headstrong and disobey their parents. Last night you stayed up till all hours playing with your dolls. You were sleepy, and a mouse may have come out and frightened you, though I can't believe we have any of those in the house. Be that as it may, you stuck your arm through the glass of the toy cabinet and cut it so badly that Dr. Wendelstern, who has just taken several pieces of glass out of the wound, says that if an artery had been cut you'd have been left with a stiff arm for life, or might even have bled to death. Thank heaven I woke up at midnight and wondered where you were. I went into the living room and found you lying beside the cabinet in a faint, bleeding terribly. I was so frightened that I almost fainted myself. There you lay, and all around you I saw Fritz's soldiers and a lot of dolls, broken banners and gingerbread men. Nutcracker was lying on your bleeding arm, and your left shoe was on the floor nearby." "Oh, Mother, Mother," Marie broke in, "there had just been a big battle between the dolls and the mice. The reason I was so scared was that the mice were going to capture my poor Nutcracker, who was in command of the dolls. So I threw my shoe at the mice, and after that I don't know what happened." Dr. Wendelstern gave Marie's mother a meaning look, and she said softly to Marie, "Never mind now, dear child. Don't worry. The mice are all gone, and Nutcracker is safe in the toy cabinet." Then Marie's father came in and had a long talk with Dr. Wendelstern. He felt Marie's pulse, and she heard some talk of wound fever. She had to stay in bed and take medicine, and that went on for several days, though apart from some slight pain in her arm, she didn't feel sick or uncomfortable. She knew that Nutcracker had come out of the battle safely, and sometimes she seemed, as if in a dream, to hear him saying to her quite distinctly, "Marie, dearest lady, I am deeply indebted to you, but you can do even more for me." She wondered what that might be, but in vain. She couldn't think of anything. She couldn't play properly because of her sore arm, and when she tried to read or leaf through her picture books, everything looked so hazy that she had to stop. Happy holidays. I saw that float up. Everything became so hazy that she had to stop. Time hung heavy on her hands, and she could hardly wait till nightfall, because then her mother sat down beside her bed and told her beautiful stories. She had just told her the excellent story of Prince Fakardin, when the door opened and Godfather Drosselmeyer stepped in, saying, "It's high time that I saw for myself how my poor little Marie is getting along." The moment Marie saw Godfather Drosselmeyer in his short yellow coat, she seemed to see Nutcracker fighting his losing battle with the mice, and without thinking she cried out, "Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, how ugly you were! I saw you sitting on the clock, covering it with your wings to keep it from striking aloud, because that would have scared the mice away. I heard you calling the king of the mice. Oh, why didn't you come to Nutcracker's help, you nasty godfather Drosselmeyer? It's all your fault that I hurt myself and have to lie here sick in bed." Marie's mother was horrified. "Dear child," she said, "what are you talking about?" But Godfather Drosselmeyer made strange faces and said in a rasping, monotonous voice, "Pendulum had to whir, softly purr, and couldn't strike. That's how pendulums are. But bells are ringing, ding, dong, bing, bong, bing, bong. Doll girl, don't be frightened. Bells are ringing loud and long to chase the king of mice away. Owl comes flying, black and gray. Pick, peck, pick and peck. Bells are ringing, clocks are whirring. Pendulums can't help whirring. Snick and snack, whir and purr." Marie stared wide-eyed at Godfather Drosselmeyer because he looked entirely different and much uglier than usual, and was moving his right arm back and forth like a marionette. She would have been really afraid of him if her mother hadn't been there, and if Fritz, who had turned up in the meantime, hadn't interrupted him with loud laughter and cried out, "Goodness gracious, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you're really funny today. You make me think of the jumping jack that I threw behind the stove the other day." But the children's mother said very gravely, "Dear Judge Drosselmeyer, what a strange rigmarole! What is the meaning of it all?" "My word," said Drosselmeyer, laughing. "Didn't you know my pretty watchmaker's song? I always sing it to little patients like Marie." With that he sat down at Marie's bedside and said, "Don't be cross with me for not putting out all 14 of the Mouse King's eyes. That wasn't possible. Instead, I've brought you something that will really give you pleasure." With that he reached into his pocket, and guess what he took out? Nutcracker, whose lost teeth he had put back in very neatly and firmly, and whose broken jaw he had fixed as good as new. Marie cried out for joy, but her mother said with a smile, "You see how good Godfather Drosselmeyer is to your Nutcracker?" "And, Marie," the judge broke in, "you'll have to admit that Nutcracker is no great beauty. Now, if you like, I shall tell you how such ugliness came into his family. Oh, yes, it's been handed down from generation to generation. Or maybe you already know the story of Princess Pirlipat, the witch Mouserynx, and the clever clockmaker?" "Hey, Godfather Drosselmeyer," Fritz interrupted, "you put Nutcracker's teeth in just right, and his jaw isn't as wobbly as it was. But why hasn't he got a sword? Why haven't you given him one?" "My dear boy," said Drosselmeyer testily, "you always have to complain. Why should I worry about Nutcracker's sword? I've cured his bodily ills. It's up to him to find himself a sword if he wants to." "That's a fact," said Fritz. "If he's worth his salt, he'll get himself the weapons he needs." "All right, Marie," the judge went on. "Tell me if you know the story of Princess Pirlipat." "No, I don't." "Oh, tell it, Godfather Drosselmeyer." "I hope," said the children's mother, "I do hope, dear judge, that this story won't be as gruesome as your stories usually are." "Oh, no, dear lady," said Drosselmeyer. "On the contrary, this is a fairy story." "Oh, tell it, dear godfather," the children cried, and the judge began. Next chapter. The story of the hard nut. Pirlipat's mother was a king's wife. That made her a queen, and the moment she was born, Pirlipat was a princess. The king was beside himself with joy over his beautiful daughter, who lay in her cradle. He cheered and danced and hopped about on one foot and shouted over and over again, "Hurrah! Has anyone ever seen anything as beautiful as my little Pirlipat?" And all his ministers, generals, counselors, and staff officers hopped about on one foot like their sovereign and shouted, "No! Never!" And indeed it was undeniable that no more beautiful child than Princess Pirlipat had been born since the world began. Her little face might have been woven of the finest lily-white and rose-red silk. Her eyes were like sparkling azure stones, and her curly locks were like threads of gold. What's more, little Pirlipat was born with 2 rows of pearly white teeth, with which, 2 hours later, she bit the Lord Chancellor's finger when he bent down to get a closer look at her features, making him scream, "Oh, Jiminy!" though it is also claimed that he just said, "Ouch." On this score, opinions are divided to this day, but Pirlipat definitely bit the Chancellor's finger, and the whole kingdom was delighted at this indication that spirit, energy, and perspicacity were housed in Pirlipat's exquisite little frame. In short, everyone was happy. Only the queen seemed troubled, though no one knew why. For one thing, she arranged for Pirlipat to be closely guarded. In addition to the sentries at the doors and 2 ladies-in-waiting sitting close to the baby's cradle, there had to be 6 nurses in the room at night. But what seemed utterly absurd and beyond understanding was that each of the 6 nurses had to hold a tomcat on her lap and stroke him so busily all night that he would never stop purring. Dear children, you couldn't possibly guess why Pirlipat's mother had to take all these precautions. But I know, and I'll tell you without delay. On a certain occasion, a number of excellent kings and charming princes had foregathered at the court of Pirlipat's father. Brilliant entertainment was provided, including tournaments, comedies, and balls. To show that he had adequate supplies of gold and silver, the king had decided to dig deeply into the royal treasury and treat his guests to something really splendid. So, when the royal head cook informed him that the court astronomer had informed him that the time was right for pork butchering, the king resolved to provide a sumptuous sausage feast. He hopped into his carriage and drove about personally inviting all the kings and princes to a simple spoonful of soup, as he put it, for he wished to enjoy their surprise. And then he said amiably to the queen, "You know, my dear, how I like sausages prepared." The queen knew exactly what he meant. He meant that she herself should perform the useful duty of sausage-making, as she had done on other occasions. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was ordered to remove the big golden sausage kettle and the silver casseroles from the great treasury vault and send them to the kitchen. A great fire was made of sandalwood. The queen put on her damask apron, and soon the kettle was steaming with delicious sausage broth, whose fragrance penetrated even to the council chamber. Overcome with delight, the king could not control himself. "Just a moment, gentlemen," he cried, and ran to the kitchen, hugged the queen, and stirred the kettle for a moment with his golden scepter. That calmed him, and he went back to the council chamber. The critical moment came when the fat had to be cut into small cubes and browned on silver spits. The ladies-in-waiting withdrew, because the queen, out of love and respect for her royal husband, wished to perform this task alone. But when the fat began to sizzle, a faint whisper was heard. "Sister," said the voice, "give me some of that. I'm a queen too, and I want something good to eat." The queen knew who it was. It was Madame Mouserings, who had been living in the royal palace for many years, and claimed to be related to the royal family. She called herself the Queen of Mosolia, and had a large retinue under the stove. The queen was a kindly woman. Though unwilling to acknowledge Madame Mouserings as her sister, she was glad to let her share in the feast. "Very well, Madame Mouserings," she said. "Come right out. Of course you may have some of my crispy fat." So Madame Mouserings came hopping out, jumped up on the stove, and with her pretty little paws grabbed one little cube of fat after another as the queen forked them out to her. But then all Madame Mouserings' aunts and uncles came running, and even her 7 sons, who were dreadful little rascals. They flung themselves on the fat, and the terrified queen found it impossible to fend them off. Luckily, the head lady-in-waiting came in, and chased the intruders away before the fat was all gone. The court mathematician was called in, and what was left of it was carefully divided in accordance with his calculations. Drums rolled and trumpets blared. The princes and potentates appeared in their resplendent robes of state, some on white palfreys, others in crystal coaches. Crown on head and scepter in hand, the king welcomed them and took his seat at the head of the table. During the liver sausage course, the king became visibly pale, and his eyes turned heavenward. Sighs escaped from his breast. Some unspeakable pain seemed to be gnawing at his vitals. But during the blood sausage course he sobbed and groaned and slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands. Everyone jumped up. The court physician tried in vain to feel the unfortunate king's pulse. Some deep, mysterious suffering seemed to be tearing him to pieces. Drastic remedies, feather quills and the like, were attempted. The queen pleaded with him to tell her what was wrong. At length he seemed to recover a little, and muttered almost inaudibly, "Not enough fat." In despair, the queen fell at his feet, sobbing. "Oh, my poor unfortunate royal husband," she cried. "Oh, what sufferings you have endured! You see the culprit here at your feet. Punish her severely. Alack, alas, Madame Mouserings with her 7 sons and her aunts and uncles ate up the fat, and—" With that the queen fell back in a faint. The king jumped up in a rage and cried aloud, "Chief lady-in-waiting, how did this happen?" The chief lady-in-waiting told him as much as she knew, and the king resolved to avenge himself on Madame Mouserings and her family, who had eaten the fat that should have been in the sausage. The privy council was summoned, and it was decided that Madame Mouserings should be tried for her life, and that all her property should be confiscated. But since the king feared that she might go on eating his fat in the meantime, the whole matter was referred to the court clockmaker and wizard. This man, whose name was the same as mine, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, promised to drive Madame Mauserinks and her family from the palace forever by an act of astute statesmanship. What he actually did was invent certain ingenious machines to which small pieces of fat were attached by threads, and placed them all over Madame Mauserinks' apartment. Madame Mauserinks was far too shrewd to be enticed by Drosselmeyer's contraptions, but all her warnings, all her remonstrances were in vain. Lured by the pungent smell of browned fat, all 7 sons and any number of aunts and uncles went straight to Drosselmeyer's engines of destruction. When they tried to nibble the fat, a gate suddenly fell, and they were captured, whereupon they were taken to the royal kitchens and ignominiously executed. Gathering what was left of her family, Madame Mauserinks left the scene of her cruel loss. Her heart was filled with rage, despair, and thirst for vengeance. The court rejoiced, but the queen lived in fear, for she knew Madame Mauserinks like a book, and felt sure she wouldn't take the death of her sons and relations lying down. True enough, Madame Mauserinks appeared in the kitchen just as the queen was cooking kidney stew for her husband, who was especially fond of that dish, and she said, "My sons, aunts, and uncles have been slain. Take care, your highness, that the queen of the mice doesn't bite your little princess in two. Take care." With that she vanished and was seen no more, but the queen was so frightened that she dropped the kidney stew in the fire. That was the 2nd time Madame Mauserinks had ruined one of the king's favourite dishes, and it made him very angry. Well, that's enough for tonight. I'll tell you the rest another time. Much as Marie, who had ideas of her own about this story, begged Godfather Drosselmeyer to go on, he sprang to his feet, saying, "Too much at a time won't be good for you. I'll tell you the rest tomorrow." As the judge was leaving the room, Fritz asked him, "Tell me, Godfather Drosselmeyer, is it really true that you invented mouse-traps?" "How can you ask such a silly question?" said Mrs. Stahlbaum. But the judge smiled strangely and said, "Do you think an ingenious clockmaker like me would be incapable of inventing a mere mouse-trap?" The next chapter is The Story of the Hard Nut, continued. "Now, children," Judge Drosselmeyer continued the next evening, "now you know why the queen had the beautiful Princess Pirlipat guarded so closely. Can you blame her for being afraid that Madame Mauserinks would carry out her threat and bite the little princess to death? Drosselmeyer's machines were of no use at all against the wily Madame Mauserinks. But the court astronomer, who was at the same time the privy astrologer, argued that Purr and Tomcat and his family had the power to keep Madame Mauserinks away from the cradle. Accordingly, each of the nurses had to hold a scion of that family. The whole lot of them were employed at court as legation secretaries. Accordingly, each of the nurses had to hold a scion of that family. The whole lot of them were employed at court as legation secretaries, on her lap, and sweetened his arduous duty by diligently scratching his back. One night, at exactly 12 o'clock, a lady-in-waiting who was sitting close by the cradle was startled from a deep sleep. All was quiet round about. Not a purr could be heard. In that deathly stillness you might have heard the woodworm nibbling in the wainscoting. Imagine how this lady-in-waiting must have felt when she saw a big, ugly mouse standing up on its hind legs with its hideous head right on top of the princess's face. The lady jumped up with a cry of horror, waking everybody else, but at that moment Madame Mauserinks, for the big mouse beside Pirlipat's cradle was none other, scurried into the corner. The legation secretaries ran after her, but too late. She had vanished into a crack in the floor. Awakened by the noise, little Pirlipat cried pitifully. "Thank goodness she's alive!" cried the nurses. But what was their horror when they looked at Pirlipat and saw what had become of the lovely, delicate child. Instead of the angelic red and white face framed in golden curls, they saw an ungainly fat head on a tiny shrunken little body, with the azure blue eyes had been changed into staring green pop-eyes, and the sweet little mouth had become a gash stretching from ear to ear. The queen almost died of grief, and the walls of the king's study had to be covered with cotton batting because he kept ramming his head against them, wailing in the most pitiful voice, Oh, what an unhappy monarch I am!" He might have realized by then that it would have been better to eat his sausages without fat, and to leave Madame Mouserings and her tribe in peace under the stove, but that wasn't how Pirlipat's royal father's mind worked. He simply put all the blame on the royal clockmaker and wizard, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg, and issued a decree giving Drosselmeyer 4 weeks to restore Princess Pirlipat to her former state, or at least suggest a surefire means of doing so, failing which he should suffer a shameful death at the hands of the royal executioner. Drosselmeyer was terrified. But then, trusting to his craft and in his luck, he did what seemed to be the first thing to do. He skillfully took Princess Pirlipat apart, unscrewed her hands and feet, and examined her inner structure. Unfortunately, he discovered that the larger she grew, the more hideous she would be, and he could think of no remedy for it. So he carefully put the princess together again, and sitting beside her cradle, which he was not allowed to leave, he sank into deepest gloom. The 4th week had already begun. Indeed, it was already Wednesday of that week when the king, his eyes flashing with rage, looked in, shook his sceptre with all his might, and cried out, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, cure the princess, or you must die!" Drosselmeyer wept bitter tears, but Princess Pirlipat just cracked nuts. For the first time, the wizard was struck by Pirlipat's unusual appetite for nuts, and also noticed that she had come into the world with teeth. The fact of the matter was that immediately after her transformation, she had begun to cry, and she had cried until a nut happened to come her way. In a trice, she had cracked the nut and eaten the kernel. That calmed her, and from then on her nurses had thought it wise to keep her supplied with nuts. Oh, holy natural instinct! Oh, eternally inscrutable sympathy of all beings, cried Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. Thou hast shown me the door to the secret. I shall knock at that door, and it will open. He asked leave to take counsel of the court astronomer, and was brought to him under heavy guard. The 2 wise men embraced and wept and embraced, for they were dear friends. Then they withdrew to a secret chamber and consulted numerous books dealing with instinct, sympathies, antipathies, and other mysterious things. Night fell. The astronomer gazed at the stars, and with the help of Drosselmeyer, who was also versed in such matters, drew up Princess Pirlipat's horoscope. This was no easy matter, for the lines of her destiny crisscrossed and tangled, but at last, oh joy, at last it was clearly revealed that all Princess Pirlipat had to do to throw off the spell that had made her ugly, and to recover her beauty, was to eat the sweet kernel of the nut Krakatuk. The nut Krakatuk had so hard a shell that a field howitzer could ride over it without cracking it. This hard nut had to be cracked in the princess's presence by the teeth of a man who had never shaved and never worn boots, and this young man would have to hand her the kernel with his eyes closed, and not open them until he had taken 7 steps backward without stumbling. Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer had been hard at work for 3 whole days and nights. That Saturday, the king had just sat down to his noonday meal when Drosselmeyer, who was scheduled to be beheaded on Sunday, burst joyously into the room and announced that he had discovered the way to restore Princess Pirlipat's lost beauty. The king embraced him rapturously, and promised him a diamond sword, 4 medals, and 2 new Sunday coats. "I expect you," he added affably, "to get to work right after lunch. Just see to it, my dear wizard, that an unshaven young man in shoes is on hand with the nut Krakatuk. And don't give him any wine to drink beforehand, because we don't want him stumbling when he takes 7 steps backwards like a crab. Afterwards, he can get as drunk as he likes." The king's words filled Drosselmeyer with consternation. Trembling and quaking, he explained to the king that though the means had been revealed, both the nut Krakatuk and the young man who could crack it with his teeth remained to be looked for, and it was doubtful whether Nut and Nutcracker would ever be found. The king, in a towering rage, swung his sceptre over his crowned head and roared with the voice of a lion, "In that case, we'll go through with the beheading." Luckily for the terrified Drosselmeyer, the king had enjoyed his lunch most especially that day, and was therefore disposed to heed the sensible advice that the magnanimous queen, who was touched by Drosselmeyer's plight, did not fail to give him. Drosselmeyer took heart, and argued that he had indeed discovered the means by which the princess could be saved, and therefore deserved to have his life spared. "Stuff and nonsense," said the king. But after downing a glass of schnapps, he decided that the 2 of them, the clockmaker and the astronomer, should set out and not come back till they had the nut Krakatuk. The man who was to crack the nut would, as the Queen suggested, be found through advertisements in the local and foreign newspapers. Here the judge broke off again and promised to finish the story the following evening. Should I finish the story now? Or should I stop this episode and finish it later? Let's see. Do the people watching have a preference? How much is left? 1 chapter. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages. It's a decently long chapter. I think I'll keep people in suspense until the next one, unless somebody really wants me to go on. The story of the hard nut concluded. Okay. Thank you for tuning in. I will be posting this, and the other episodes, I posted them on YouTube, if people want to listen to the beginning. Okay, see you later then. Yep, bye Hal, thank you for coming. Thank you everybody else. I will be putting this up on YouTube shortly, and of course it'll be available on Periscope for 24 hours. Happy holidays to everybody.